Let's Take This Outside with Marianne Iveson, the podcast where she speaks to athletes, outdoor professionals, and scientists about why they connect with nature.
Dr. Sasha Gollish is a passionate advocate for gender equity in sport, a Team Canada middle and long distance runner, and a dedicated mentor to young athletes. With a career spanning elite athletic competition, coaching, engineering, and research, Sasha combines her expertise to inspire girls and women to excel in sport and life. And before we dive into this episode, Sasha is a Chrono nutrition athlete, and we've teamed up with Chrono to give away 2 of their discovery boxes on our Instagram, including bars, gels, and electrolytes. Head to the Let's Take This Outside Instagram for your chance to win, and also use the promo code OUTSIDE20 to get 20% off at chrononutrition.com for the month of March. Please welcome Dr. Sasha Gollish. Sasha Gollish, welcome to Let's Take This Outside. I'm so excited to chat with you. I can already tell that we're going to get along just fine.
I mean, we probably could have talked for hours, before. We probably talked for hours now, but yeah, I am equally as excited to be here.
You are a runner for Team Canada, a civil engineer. You advocate for women in sport. You're what I call a classic overachiever that I tend to have on this podcast. Thank you for having me. I jokingly called you an underachiever before because I was like, oh, you just literally do everything. It's no big deal. Do you know that you're an overachiever? Do you know?
Yeah. Oh,
you do. Okay. Is there anything that you're compensating for, or do you want to dive into that, or are you just...
No, I think...
I'm sorry, that was ironic.
No,
I was just...
no,
trying to be funny.
Here, let me share you some past relationship advice. I knew that this one relationship was over when someone said to me, Phil was just you're always trying to prove to other people, right, who you are. And I'm like, do you not understand that there's this burning fire in my belly to be a better version of myself every day and chase these things? And so it's almost like perfectionism where we actually are learning that there's some good aspects of perfectionism. So I'm not a recovering overachiever. There's just this it's who I am. There's this burning desire in me to chase after these things that are important to me. And I just happen to be one of those people in life who's oh my gosh, I have all these things that are important to me.
And you're good at all of them, which is great.
Oh, no, I am not. No. I love dancing. I am terrible. Old school Elaine Seinfeld dancing, terrible at it. I'm not a very good Nordic skier, but I love connecting with nature. And as I'm getting older, I actually love trying things that I'm not good at so that you stretch your brain in different ways. Just before we were talking about concussion and brain injury, as a brain injury survivor, it's really important that I challenge my brain. And I think really important for my ego and empathy and just learning to be a better version of myself is actually trying things that I'm bad at and actually just staying bad at certain things. Not because I don't want to get better at them, just to understand I'm not going to be excellent at everything.
Yeah, being mediocre at something is a great life lesson.
Right?
Yeah. I do want to talk about running, and because that's the thing that you're the best at. But I want to talk about Nordic skiing just because it's my favorite thing to do. I'm not very good. Also, there's literal Olympians in Gatineau Park who train there. So it's hard to you don't really know where the bar is. As a runner for Team Canada, I find Nordic skiing extremely challenging. How do you find it? You said you're not very good at it, but I'm sure you're better than you think you are. But
okay, so it's funny. I've really been thinking about this lately. So I like to do classic and skate, and many of my running friends are oh, you can't get a good enough workout unless you're skate skiing. I'm okay, if you ever
not true,
right? And I can turn myself inside out on my classic skis as well. I think what made it better for me is I do have kind of weak ankles. So I played field hockey in high school, rolled my ankles all the time, and my dad was your crappy ankles. Right. My orthopedic surgeon father was oh, you just have crappy ankles. And so I have pretty bad ankle instability, and classic Nordic ski boots have no ankle stability.
None.
And
no.
You wonder why people don't come back to this sport. Cause that makes it really not fun. So I bought combi boots, and actually recently I've just been classic skiing in my skate boots because they have ankle support and it's so much more enjoyable. And so one that made me a little bit better because I wasn't always legs flopping around. Yeah. But one of the things with Nordic skiing, coming into it, as a competitive runner was I don't want to be competitive in it. And partly, I'm going through this injury right now with running, and I'm not quite sure what my relationship is going to be with it post-surgery, but I want to be able to have sports that because I thought running was going to be the sport that I did for the rest of my life. And I'm hoping that it can, but also opening my eyes to doing other sports for the rest of my life, but interacting, just being mediocre at it. And you enjoy it in a different way. So there's something meditative and that connection with nature in a different way, Nordic skiing. Like, I'd love to hear your perspective as well as to like why it's so, I don't know, like soul filling. It's soul filling.
I think it's a combination of being outside in the winter, but also being a decent temperature, like in your core is great, right? Being able to like bring up that heat in your core temperature. So I think it's a combination of like the core heat and then like kind of the chill on your face, which is like a great combination. I think that like hot tea or hot chocolate or something waiting for you at the end, I think is beautiful, or having soup after feels really good, changing out of your wet clothes. I think it's like the whole experience of it. There's also cabins in Gatineau Park that you can ski to and have a fire. I think it's just the whole community and that combination of hot and cold that it just thrills you, right? Also, Canada is so dark. We struggle to get vitamin D, and it's a reason to be outside. So I would say like if it's like a -8 day, you're outside, the sun is shining, and like you have perfect ski conditions, like nothing beats a day like that, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's pretty special. I'm a big fan of like the post-ski hot chocolate made with cow's milk, as I'm a big proponent of like maximizing your protein and like particularly where I'm at in life. So there are mini marshmallows. I like went between like big marshmallows and mini marshmallows, but mini marshmallows are definitely the way to go with hot chocolate.
They're way easier to eat.
Yeah. I've choked way too many times on the big marshmallow. Too large.
Okay, so I haven't even gotten to my first question yet. I love this so much. But okay, let me try to ask you an official question. I could talk about marshmallows all day, but you grew up in Toronto, which I'm not going to lie, sometimes we make fun of Toronto because it's hard sometimes to find nature. But what was your experience of the outdoors when you were a kid?
Oh, you know what? I'm like, connects to childhood, but just now. So I just went to Sunnybrook Park, and I only, like, it's a really busy day meeting wise, but I was like, get outside. So I skied for 30 minutes in Sunnybrook Park, right? Like, just threw on my rock skis, went into the park. So my connection with nature was, Sunnybrook Park was a big part of my childhood. It's where I ran my first cross country race. It's this like big park in North Toronto that many kids played sports in. And we were just an outdoors family. So I grew up in a really privileged neighborhood. We lived in these like, I lived in a very large house beside somebody else with a very large house, but we were a little bit of the UN. So grew up in a Jewish family. My neighbors were Iranian. And I just need you to picture us like racing bicycles around the driveway and like chasing each other, playing capture the flag, playing tag, swimming in pools. Their grandparents always had pomegranates. We had a cherry tree and a pear tree in the backyard. Like, it was just this like outdoor adventure. And actually snow, they had this like tiny little hill, and just like 1,000 times in an afternoon, like just running up and down the hill and going up and down. So it was just lots of like play-based activities, free play. My parents were both physicians, and like organized sport wasn't a big thing back in the late 80s, early 90s. Like, it was coming around, but we didn't do a ton of that other than alpine skiing for 9 weeks in the winter. And then I went to summer camp in the summers. I really am not selling myself. I really lived a charmed, it's out of a storybook for sure, but just a whole lot of different activities and different ways to play outside. You were outside as much as like you came in for dinner and went to bed basically.
So where did, like, you said you did cross country running when you were a kid, but how did you get into running and get to a point where then you're competing? But you didn't start competing until like you were like 32 though, which is, I'm putting in air quotes, late.
Old, actually, just put old. Forget
okay,
late, old. People just were like, you're old. I'm like, you've no idea. And like now, I'm like, well, you have no idea. My mom was a runner growing up, right? She'd come home from work, she'd throw her shoes on, go out for 5 or 6K, 30 minutes to herself. And you know, growing up as someone who like always like emulated and wanted to be their mother and was inspired by them, that's how I got into it. My mom and I ran the inaugural CIBC, it wasn't CIBC, but Run for the Cure together. My mom broke 20 minutes. She was like, you lead the way. I was this like 10-year-old. She broke 20 minutes and she was like, okay, well, I will never run with you again in a race. Thank you very much. I mean, I competed in high school, like Ontario. I ran at OFSA. I ran cross country and track, and went to the University of Toronto, had scholarship options and opportunities, and didn't want to go down to the States, and kind of like burnout, quit running when I was in second year university. And while I didn't stop running, like definitely took it way less seriously. I did 2 undergrads. I have a gap undergrad where I was like, I don't really know what I want to do with my life. So I'm going to go do like, I went into commerce, didn't work out for me, ended up in engineering at the University of Western, but like finished an arts degree instead of finishing commerce and then went into engineering and always used running as my thinking time. I also then did what engineers do in undergrad and drank as much beer as I possibly could, but always just like kind of stayed engaged with it. So my mom got me into it. My parents always encouraged us to stay active. And my mom was really the one that like, when like things started to come together again, who like gave me like the push to say like, you need to go do this. So my mom, the short story is my mom.
If your mom is still around, does she still run?
My mother is still around. She does not still run. My mother is barely 5 feet tall and always wore like the highest of heels.
Yeah.
And we know what that does to your Achilles. So my mom still walks. My mom and I Nordic ski a ton together too. And we alpine ski together. So while my mom does not run, she is still working at the University of Toronto in the medical school and is still a physician. And she probably runs if I had to guess, she actually probably runs from meeting to meeting sometimes. That's her running.
Still running. That still counts.
Yeah.
So, you're in university. What happens by the time you're 32 and you're like, I'm going to start competitively running? And you're a civil engineer at this point, I'm guessing, and you're working full time. Where does, competition and running come in?
So I was working at this like really awesome engineering construction company with really amazing people, long consulting hours, loved what I did. And my girlfriends were like, hey, you're working, like, can you come socialize again? And I was like, well, I kind of need to be active. So they were runners. I went back to the University of Toronto track club. I was running with my high school coach, Ross Restucci at the time. And that was my socializing for the week. So like Monday, Thursday, I negotiated with work. I would go in like even earlier, so like 6, so that I could then leave from Aurora, which if you know Toronto traffic, trying to get from Aurora, and this is 10 years ago, I can't imagine doing it now, down to Toronto to get on the subway to go to U of T and go to practice, and went from it just being this like social thing to racing. And in my first race back, I took 30 seconds off my 3,000 time. And it was just like, what? And so Ross booked me a plane ticket to Europe to go race. And I was like, I have a full-time job. I can't, in the middle of construction season in July, get on a plane for 2 weeks and go race. And my boss was like, yeah, you can. He's like, finish up this like inspection, take your computer with you, finish up the report there. Like you can have it all. And it was over there that like, it was like, okay, you've got something really special going on. And so 2 things happened. So one, I called my mother this is when cell phones and cell phone plans, like I think the call cost us like $10 for 90 seconds.
You're right.
And my mom was like, okay, you need to think about quitting your job and running full time. And I was like, I'll think about that on the plane ride home. In which case I actually just watched children's movies and thought about nothing. But when I went back to work, what really gave me permission was Ben Powell of Powell Contracting. He said, you either have to quit or I'm firing you because you have to go do this. Unbelievably compassionate, empathetic man, but also like 6'4" and a giant. And I was like, you need to get out of this office because I'm going to start crying. And I was like, out. And I needed the permission from, people that I looked up to and others that this was the right thing to do. Right. We live in Canada where like we celebrate athletes, but we diminish them, like further in my career, like when are you going to get a real job? When are you going to, go back to doing like contributing to society? Like, we still have this like dichotomization of sport where we like celebrate it when people do well, but we don't actually celebrate the journey. And I had these 2 people who were so important to me in my life. Ben just wasn't my boss. He was my friend, giving me permission to go on that journey. And so that's what like gave me the confidence to like step away. I will also say that Ben was like, I'll keep you on as part-time staff. And like, so you can make some money as you're like figuring out this running thing.
And I'm sure you know this, but like, that's sort of a privilege, right? To be able to
totally,
right? To have that opportunity, because talking to other athletes and Olympians, like that is an incredibly hard thing to balance. A lot of athletes like dedicate, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but a lot of athletes don't take the same route you do. They were athletes first and then eventually go back to school, right? So you kind of did it the other way around, and then had this amazing boss who was like, you got to go live your dream. You are clearly very good at this.
A privilege and a gift, right? It's a gift to have people like that in your life, right? And again, like I come from a place of privilege, and I knew that like, one, I could always go back to engineering, right? I could always go back to work, but I also had this like safety net of like my parents and, my partner. Like I had the same partner that, I was together with then, of like, you've got to do this. And I get that not everybody has that. I think, I also ran, right? So running and middle and long distance running like affords you some different opportunities in terms of like things that you can balance, right? I'm not, on a basketball, soccer, volleyball team where like you have to be on court or on the pitch with your teammates at specific times. And so I think there's some nuance to it, but I think that we're also like trying to live in a way that like sport has taken off in such a different way, but also sport conventionally. And I think, it just needs a lot of rethinking and like replanning. I heard this great quote, which is like sort of related to this and unrelated to this. At the weekend, I was at the Empower Her Sports Summit. And I think it was Larissa Mills who said, if your screen time is greater than your practice time, then you don't get to complain about your game time. And I think that like, if we could get athletes to put their phones down, I think they'd be better athletes, but I think it would open their eyes to being able to do other things and engage in other ways, as opposed to just like scrolling social media and or watching, like there is a time and place for like relaxing and watching TV shows. I can say Netflix and chill, but there's many other streaming services out there now, but just how we engage with it in a little bit differently. Like Erica Wiebe, when she won the 2016 gold medal for wrestling at Rio, right? Like she was involved with academics, right? And drew excellence from both those things. And I don't know. I think the model's a little bit broken. I think it's contributing to some of our safe sport challenges right now as well. And I think we just need to like we don't take a pause, but I think we need to start thinking in like different ways about like how we look at sport and professional sport and a whole bunch of other things.
Well, I think there's also proof in that when so many athletes end up training in the U.S., right? And going to U.S. colleges, right? Just like the priorities are very different. I'm not saying it's better, but I guess it depends what sport you want to do too, right? Like,
yeah.
You have some very impressive stats from your running career, like winning a bronze medal at the 2015 Pan Am Games, right, in the 1500. That's amazing. But this is the one that stuck out to me. This is an outdoor podcast. I wonder if you know what I'm going to say. I was fascinated by your win in 2022 of the women's vertical climb at the Canadian Mountain and Trail Running Championships in Virden, BC. That's true, right?
Yeah.
So what is that? And cross country is trail running, right? Essentially, kind of?
It was. Now it's very much like golf course running, but yes.
What is this vertical climb? How high was it? And how did you get involved? How do you go from but running around a track to running up a mountain, essentially?
So in 2022, kind of like coming out of the pandemic, I thought it was going to be my retirement year. And one of the criticisms that I faced was I never picked one event and I was always like dabbling in them. And it was just framed in a way that was like negative as opposed to like strength-based perspective. Someone should have framed it better. But anyways, I have great endurance and I have great speed. So as part of the Canadian Championships that year, one of the events was like, you couldn't do all of the mountain running and trail championships because they all kind of like started in and around the same time. And I was like, I know what I'll do. I'm going to go run straight up a mountain just outside of Kelowna. So the vertical kilometer is you have to cover a kilometer over height wise. And the distance to get there varies depending on how steep the course was. And course is. So like I've seen them as short as 6K. So you can imagine what the vertical gain is on that. And I've seen them as long as like 13 and 14K. I think that one was around, I actually don't even remember. I do remember section of it being like, this is so steep. Effectively, like just imagine that like, if you've ever done the grouse grind, there are sections where like the grouse grind, like hands on your knees, like you are like taking big steps up, and then other sections that you're like running. Some of it can be more technical. I had done it the year before in Quebec, where it quite literally felt like you were like climbing the face of like a green mountain, and then you went on the most
Quebec,
technical Le Massif du Sud. Le Massif du Nord is a fabulous place to go alpine skiing. Le Massif du Sud has a wall that you have to run up.
I interrupted you. You said it was okay, and then what happened?
It was so technical that I was like, oh my God, it's the most technical trails I've ever seen in my life. I'm just going to walk.
Yeah, Eastern Canada and Eastern US, some of the most technical trails you will ever find. Yeah.
So I basically like ran straight up a mountain is effectively what happened. And it was this
you won. And
I won. It was cool because like you were like basically in the trees and you couldn't see anything. And then in the last 200 meters, like you had this like beautiful view of the lake in Kalamalka Park. And I was like, oh, legs burning though.
Can I ask the difference for you, trail running versus track running, outdoor running? Because they're a very different experience.
I mean, yes and no. In the last 50 meters, every event feels the same, right? Like your legs are burning, your chest is burning, like everything hurts. You don't think you can make it to the finish line.
I just mean like not racing, not necessarily racing. I just mean the experience of being out there and running in two different scenarios.
I think I've always just looked at things differently. Like, take the challenge, take the risk. I knew that running the uphill race was only going to make like my 5 and 10,000 better. Like, it's a strength based as opposed to like pure speed and endurance. It, challenges your muscles in a different way, which I think in terms of injury prevention is really important. Grayson, so Grayson Murphy, she's a phenomenal vertical runner. She's also an incredible steeplechaser. And I think it's just like shifting how we think about training and what we're doing to actually become better athletes. David Roach and Megan Roach, who are her coach, like talk about how we, so often in road running, like, yeah, you've got to like build up this tolerance. But I think more importantly, we need to like think differently about how we're training to like build our systems in other ways. Particularly, we've been doing the training for a long time, right? Like, you do build up some resistance to it. And so like, if you really want to maximize those gains, you're going to have to do something different. And then what I really liked about the trail running was that you had to be so focused. And it was such a good way to like practice those like challenging moments where like things get really challenging in a track race or a road race, where you have to be so focused on just like moving forward and ignoring what's going on in your body that you can like use that as a tactic in somewhere else where you play. And then like vice versa, like, when you're screaming down the end of an 800 and your legs are burning, you're like, okay, well, it does go away. So when I come up and over this steep part and I like get onto this flat, I am actually going to feel better.
Okay. So it's the mental side of it the angle that you're looking at.
It was everything: mental, physical, nature.
All the things.
All the things.
Let's Take This Outside now has a newsletter. Keep up to date with outdoor news, events, and great discount codes and deals from our partners. Sign up today at letstakethisoutside.ca.
If there's anything I've learned in this podcast is that there is still a gap in opportunity for all, like in sport. And even research behind women's bodies in sport is still so behind. We're in 2024. It's like appalling. Tell me about your work in gender equity in sport and how did you get involved? Like, what does that look like for you?
Oh, it makes my day so much fun, right? Like it's a host in a world of opportunities. So come from an engineering background, really care about data, like to give evidence-informed answers, but also like thinking about things through a design cycle. So, who's the user group and how are we trying to solve it? And like, generally speaking, what we're trying to do is like make exercise, movement, and in this case, running, more accessible to women. Right? Like the marathon in particular, like we still see sort of 70-30 breakdown as it comes to like, men's participation versus women's participation. So then how do we think about this as like this opportunity to bring more women into the sport? And so like in the last year, I've done a lot of work with ASICS Global, depending on where you're in the world and how you say that.
Oh,
right?
really? Okay.
But, yeah. So like thinking about like, how do we make it more inclusive? How do we make it more accessible? How do we redefine it? And I think in doing that, like we actually are going to change these like gendered expectations and these gender norms. And so my work plays out in a variety of different ways, right? Like I've got a couple contracts that I'm working on with. One is obviously with ASICS. I'm also working at the university on a youth-based project where we're asking the question from coast to coast to coast, what could a reimagined, equitable, diverse, inclusive, and accessible sports system look like, especially for girls, right? Like knowing that like historically girls face more barriers to entry to sport. And so, we're really thinking about it through these identity factors, right? So we know girls in particular face more barriers to sport. But then when you layer on things like race and ethnicity, right? Being an Indigenous person here in Canada, social class, like just the cost of actually doing sport, body diversity, and then disability. And when you layer on those intersecting identities, the access to sport goes down and those barriers go up. And so working with researchers, but more importantly, working with community groups that are really helping to overcome those barriers to make sport accessible for girls and girls that are like have more of those identity factors.
Where can I find some of this? Or is there Instagram pages we can follow or?
We are going through a rebranding. I'm going to be very politically correct and just say our rebranding will be coming out shortly. We've faced some barriers in terms of like partnerships that we've been working on. If you go to, I think, the Rethink Sport Project, there's very minimal information, but gives you a little bit of a taste what's going on. And then that website will always direct to wherever we end up at. But one of the things I'd love to celebrate as we talk about it is we have a youth collective. And so we've got this group of lovely young individuals from across Canada between the ages of 12 and 18 who are really informing the research. And so right now they're actually really informing our branding, our mission, our vision, our attributes, and our values. So I was supposed to work on that last week, but instead I gave myself food poisoning. So I will be working on that this week.
I'm not just trying to cross-promote my own podcast, but I just talked to Judy Kasiyama. She is the founder of Color the Trails.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. She's amazing. So
she's amazing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that podcast will be out yet at this point, but a really beautiful episode in terms of like opening people's eyes to equity and inclusion in sport and the outdoors especially is work that we need to do. One thing I definitely want to talk about and something that really like flagged for me on your Instagram was perimenopause and menopause and female athletes going through it. So personally, I'm not there yet, or maybe I am. I don't know. I'm 36, but several people very close to me who are in their mid 40s now have when I say gone through it, I mean gone through it. It's a nightmare. The insomnia, the fatigue, the forgetfulness, the like ADHD-like symptoms, the like go on and on and on. The weight gain. I feel like that's just like a smidgen of the, like, am I right on all of those?
Oh my gosh. And more. One of the biggest challenges with this is our symptoms are unique.
Right. So can you kind of shed some light on what perimenopause is and maybe your journey through it? I didn't have any specific questions. I just wanted to talk to you about it because like there's so many questions around it and like how we can take care of ourselves better. But essentially, what is perimenopause? It feels like this mythical thing that is very much real, but like no one really talks about it till lately. It's wild. It's a wild thing.
It's barely in the medical literature as well, right? Like, so let me just like asterisk this with like, I am aware of perimenopause. I read the literature. I check for credible evidence. I'm not an expert in menstrual cycles, periods. I'm an expert in myself. So
perfect.
Perimenopause is the time between like normal cycling. So like what we were all like, remember grade school, right? Like you're going to get your period every 28 days. And then one day it goes away. Wrong, false, wrong biology class. One day it's going to change and then it will cease, the cessation period. So menopause is actually a moment in time where your period stops and then you're actually post-menopause. And perimenopause is the time from when you go from normal cycling into this like irregular cycling. You're going to feel the worst you've felt in your entire life. You're going to wonder what is going on. You'll often be lying on your back, looking at the ceiling, being like, I should be asleep. I don't know what's wrong. So it's this time where like our periods change going into menopause and post-menopause. Really what's happening is our estrogen levels are dropping, right? And so what triggers our periods every month, right, is like the natural release of progesterone and estrogen, and like there's graphs and things happen in hormones, right? So our hormones change throughout the cycle, pushing the egg drop, pushing our periods unless you get pregnant. In perimenopause, basically the hormones run off the tracks. And particularly what happens is estrogen starts to drop, and then sometimes estrogen spikes depending on what your body's trying to produce. That weight gain, so there were a couple like flags that I didn't know about that really would have told me I was in perimenopause. So I had like pretty normal 2 to 2.5 day periods, regular bleed, and then all of a sudden it was like a crime scene. And it was like, oh my God, I'd never had cramping. So I had horrible, debilitating cramps. And I had really heavy bleeding. I've since gotten an IUD as like hormone replacement, just in terms of the progesterone, which has like solved all of those things, which has also then helped with the estrogen. So like that was a flag for me. And then number 2, which happened several years later, was the weight gain. So estrogen is a fat produced molecule or hormone. I guess it might be a molecule. Sorry, chemists who are listening to this, if I just... Yeah. Okay. Sorry, chemist. Anyways, fat produced. And so generally what happens with women is like our natural place to like be able to like build fat is our tummies. So they talk about the menopouch, the menopaunch, right? Our hips and our breasts. And so all of a sudden I had these like super tender, also much larger than usual breasts, some weight around my midsection and some weight around my hips. And so I'm now taking something called pregnenolone, which is the precursor to estrogen. So like for any of you who are listening, are like, is that banned by WADA? No, I'm not taking a precursor to testosterone. I'm taking a precursor to the hormone that makes you recover even worse. So just as like I did look into this from an anti-doping perspective. And so those are the like two like big things, is the weight gain and I think really the sleep. So I did the pregnenolone and then changing up my diet. And changing up my diet really improved my sleep. So I'm just going to like go back to say I have always been an outstanding sleeper. So before we got on this, I was saying like I slept an entire way from Toronto to Calgary on a flight this weekend on the way to a conference. I then got in the shuttle and then slept all the way in the shuttle from the Calgary airport to Canmore. I slept all the way home on the airplane. I've always been a really good sleeper, and I can like kind of make myself fall asleep anywhere if I just need the recovery. And I was noticing that like I couldn't sleep. So my estrogen production going up really helped, and then changing my diet. So as a 1,500 meter and marathon runner, I was effectively like a garburator. I was a trash can. I could eat whatever I wanted. I was saying to you earlier, Pop-Tarts. Pop-Tarts were my like go-to in terms of like, I need fuel to like get through this workout. I either want a strawberry Pop-Tart or I want a s'mores Pop-Tart. Those were like my favorite go-tos. And it was like, and I should do an Instagram video. It was like, I might as well have like taken the Pop-Tart out of the package and just like stuck it to the side of my leg, stuck it to my like waist. Like all of a sudden I couldn't use what was like, you know, quotation marks, cheap fuel anymore. Like my body just could no longer process it. And so I was like, okay, you know, I started doing some me search and like looking online. It's like, you still need carbohydrate and simple carbohydrate for fuel, but I needed to start getting it from better sources again. And so leaning into products that are of, you know, a higher quality. I'm really into the Chrono products right now. Leaning into eating more fruits and vegetables, right? So fewer vegetables before like big hard efforts for gastro reasons, but you can still use a lot of fruit, right? And then fueling up after, you know, ensuring that like I was buying much better bread to have like my nut butter and jam sandwich, and like buying homemade jams or making the jams myself, and just like really leaning into eating better, right? And ensuring I was getting like really high quality carbohydrates and proteins. And then you also need fat to like process the protein and carbohydrate. But years ago, I bought my partner an olive oil subscription from Italy. So we have this like delicious olive oil that like I drink two things out of the bottle. One is maple syrup and two is olive oil.
Both delicious. I approve of both. Can I ask you quickly more about Chrono?
Yeah.
Tell me more why you like it, and like, because it's like, which one do I like? Is it the maple one I really like? I think it's delicious.
Are you talking about the gel?
Yeah, the gel.
Yeah. So once upon a time, there's a bar called a Picky Bar, right? Lauren Fleshman and Steph Rothstein and Jesse, it's terrible, I can't remember Jesse's last name. Picky Bar was like my favorite thing in the world, right? Like made with natural ingredients. Impossible to get in Canada. And when it did come to Canada, it was like the price point, you were like, okay. And then all of a sudden, I was working out and hanging out with Sawyer Nicholson, and she's this like little phenom, and she's like, I got this bar, and it was this chocolate cherry bar, and I was like, okay, well, you've just put two of my favorite things in the entire world into a bar. You've got dried cherries with chocolate, and they're moist and they're delicious, and they were made with dates, and there's just something about like the moistness in a bar with dates that like gets me. And then you added in like the cherries and the chocolate, and then, you know, like there's the pineapple and raspberry, so it tastes like real food, right? And so there's a palate acceptance as well. And then same with the gels, right? Like there's so many gels out there that like you put it in your mouth and you're like, this is weird.
This is so unnatural. It just, yeah.
Yeah. And right, the Chrono gels are honey and maple syrup, right? Like two natural ingredients that our bodies can use. And I think, you know, like, again, no evidence around this, but like if we just think about it, like it's not a processed refined food. Like I think our bodies are just like naturally ready to digest that better. And I am like gut sensitive person.
Same,
like
yeah.
Just my gut is not like, my partner is like, you're amazing except for your teeth and your stomach. So like I just struggle with digestion, and I have had no digestion issues. And you know, if you struggle with that, like you've got to find a product that works for you. And I think it's got to just be something natural that your body can actually digest, which is like what drew me to it. And then I'm just like the chocolate cherry. I literally remember being on the phone with him being like, I'm obsessed with your chocolates and cherries.
Thank you for sharing. And I know you're not, you said me search is what you called it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like your own research. As women, how can we take care of ourselves better through this phase? Or is there any advice you can give, whether it's like pushing people to like see certain doctors or nutritionists or dietitian? Like, is there any advice you could give people in terms of taking care of themselves in this phase?
I mean, we'd need a day for that. So I'll try and do it like pretty quickly and pretty high level. I think you got to work with someone you trust who you can be pretty open and honest with about your symptoms, right? So a lot of the symptoms show up as like REDS, which is relative energy deficiency syndrome, but you're gaining weight. And you actually may be in some energy deficiency because you're not processing things. So you got to have a family doc or a general GP, general practitioner doctor that like understands you and understands what it is like to work with females. They don't have to be female. My doctor is male. He is phenomenal. I remember when I called him and I was like, I think I'm in perimenopause. And he's like, I don't think so, but like walk me through it. At the end, he's like, yeah, you are. He's like, no question. So you've got to have like trusted people around you. I think in terms of like minimizing the burden as to like who you think you need to see, I think it's like really stepping back to figure out like what are the challenges that you're facing and then figuring out who you need to see. Sleep and nutrition to me are just like part of this cycle. If you don't get the sleep piece right and you don't get the nutrition piece right, you're less likely to be physically active. I think going back to some of the like ASICS learnings, challenging these gendered expectations. And so also reaching out to your partners. If you've got kids and you've got, a lot of like family duties, even if you don't have kids and you're the like primary person that takes care of the house, having a conversation of like, hey, I'm going through these challenges and I really need to prioritize physical activity in my life because it's going to help me eat better and it's going to help me sleep better and it's good for my mental health. And it's good for your mental health. Being able to have those conversations. And so just being like, if you're not really self-aware of like what's going on, like creating a routine to create more of that self-awareness around some of what your symptoms are. And then really protecting the time to like connect with yourself to see how you're really feeling through this, to connect with yourself with like how your nutrition is going, how your sleep is going, how your physical activity is going. And then, if you're working or, your relationships with like your partners, your kids, like really checking in on that stuff, right? And making that a priority. And that'll cycle. I'm not saying prioritize those all the time, but like being aware of like where you feel like there might be gaps, but also playing into the strengths, right? Like indigenous ways of knowing and doing versus like settler colonial. Like settler colonial, like we're always looking for the gaps, but like play to your strengths, right? If something's going well, play to that, right? And like celebrate those like little wins every day.
Where do you see your athletic career taking you at this point? And second half of that question is, what do you want your life to look like when you're 85? You're going to be cross-country skiing, that's for sure.
Yeah, those are great questions. I actually can't answer the first one right now. The only thing I really know is that in April, I'm going to have a knee surgery. So I pinched the fat pad in my knee, which is like, you're like, what? What's a fat pad? And it was this like protective layer in your knee, but it's full of nerves. And if you pinch it, one, you like kind of don't know. I like had no idea that it was going to happen. There were no symptoms. And then you go from 0 to 10 out of 10 pain. And then it takes 3 to 6 months to recover. And then sometimes it doesn't recover and it's full of scar tissue and they have to operate on it, which is where I'm at. So I can't actually answer that question. I think I know, and I don't want to accept that my like high level competing career is over. I think I'm leaving the possibility of it post surgery, but I think it's close to like 1%, 10%, not 90%. But I also don't want to close the door on that. And I was actually thinking about it on the treadmill this morning, not because of this podcast, but just like, where do I see this going? And I'm wrestling with like, I have a full-time job that I love and I've taken on all these contracts and, fitting in exercise. I'm like, no, you know what? A priority in your life is being active. And if you want to work out for a couple hours a day and you get everything else done, then do that. Be kind and transparent with those that you're working with, that this is important to you. But I'm not going to sacrifice a piece of my identity. And it's not the identity that I have to be a high-level athlete, but it's the identity that I love connecting with nature and people and being active. And I'm going to keep that as part of my life. There is a book, Bianca Maris, I think, wrote it. It's like this like witch's mansion and like all of these women live together. So when I was a kid, like the Bridle Path is like the most expensive place you can live in Toronto, which is not what I wanted to live there. I just like saw these big houses and I was like, I want to live there with all of my active girlfriends. And when I'm 85, I'd love to be living in a place, and it's probably more like a condo building, right? Where everybody around me is active, where we're outside and we're Nordic skiing. And if I can alpine ski and I can hike and I can run, which will probably be a shuffle run. So I have these like they're actually 4 life goals, 3, 4. Anyways, we're going to go through them. So I always want to be able to squat so that I can hover over a toilet seat no matter what is there. I don't necessarily have, right? And you have to have quad strength and core strength to do that. I want to be able to flush that toilet with my toes because that means I've maintained my flexibility. And I want to be able to do a chest press and get my bag in the overhead compartment so I can travel anywhere in the world that I want to go and not need anybody's help. So that's my goal.
I would never in a million years would have ever guessed those 3 things. That is incredible. That's an incredible standard.
And easy, right? Those are things that we can work on. And even if we lose them, we can come back to them and work on them, right? And simple, right? It is something simple and attainable.
Thank you for all of your work in gender equity and in letting us know more about perimenopause. And you're just such an overachiever, a super impressive human being. And thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. For more Let's Take This Outside, go to letstakethisoutside.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.